As a final reflection, this lecture looks at the current state of things, at what feminism means today, and at some of the obstacles it faces. I will do that by asking about the co-option of feminism. This is to ask about how feminist theory and practice is absorbed, twisted, and hijacked via different social and political mechanisms in the world it seeks to change. Feminism is still relevant today because it is a reaction to something real, the fact of patriarchy. Sure, the kind of patriarchy feminists are facing today is not the same as that confronted by feminists in the 18th, 19th century. But it doesn't seem quite right to express that difference by saying that things are less bad than they used to be. It is true that formal legal inequalities between men and women have diminished, in some cases due to the feminist struggle. It is also true that sexist or misogynistic attitudes have had to become more subtle, at least in certain circles. It is generally not okay to say publicly that women are less intelligent than men, although the frequency with which it is still said or implied is striking, as is the relative lack of repercussions. But in many cases, it's not entirely clear whether the newer forms of patriarchy have got better rather than merely more subtle. And in some cases, even the issue of subtlety is debatable. For instance, the treatment and construction of women as sex objects, as objects to be bought and sold, and as consumers of endless products regarded as necessary to make them beautiful, has arguably intensified over the last decades. To understand the development of patriarchy, we must focus both on the ways it is getting better and on the ways it is getting worse. Increasingly subtle and also increasingly crude. We also need to be careful in not confounding the feminism that exists with the feminism that is most visible to large numbers of people, or between feminism and what calls itself feminism. Plenty of people who recognize the oppression of women and the need to end it don't call themselves feminists, and plenty who do don't recognize either. Another issue we must be careful about is that the public face of feminism is rather fickle and changeable, which perhaps is only to be expected in a mass media society characterized by a cult of novelty and by restless competition for the attention of consumers. So, some people would talk about a third wave of feminism, or even the fourth and the fifth waves, without really being clear what each of these waves is meant to stand for. Take the so-called third feminist wave. Some identify it as post-feminism, the view that women are liberated now and just need to adjust to their new liberties and enjoy them, just like men do. Others associate it with raunch culture, the embrace of a highly sexualized, daring lifestyle of unrestrained consumption. And others yet identify it with the request to get more women into high places. Another interpretation is bound up with the cult of the superwoman. We are told that as modern women, we either do or should aspire to the holy trinity of sexiness, high-powered career success, and motherhood. Another use of the term associates it with a more inclusive movement, sympathetic to queer identities, and more accommodating for certain groups, such as sex workers, which have found themselves alienated by the traditional feminist tendency to problematize their activities and occupation. So, far from a clear picture as to what this third wave is supposed to be. The fourth wave is even more ambiguous. Most often it is taken to refer to an upbeat form of campaign to improve the public image of women, to resist cruder forms of objectification, and to celebrate women, especially great women. But even if we cannot provide a straightforward characterization of these new waves in feminism, it is still possible to identify three broad tendencies in 21st century feminism. First, there is the let's get more women into X variety, where X stands for boardroom, parliament, armed forces, police, top earners, or whatever existing compartment of the society recognized by the status quo. Note that this strand of feminism is clearly reformist. It leaves existing institutions and social structures unaltered, calling only for an equal gender balance within those institutions and structures. Second, there is the empowerment varieties of feminism, many of which turn out to involve things like embracing and participating in activities which have traditionally been criticized by feminists, and buying things. Then there is also a variety of feminism which focuses on the need to rescue brown women from the tyranny of brown men. These newer forms of feminism are best understood with the help of the general category of co-option. The term co-option, sometimes also referred as cooptation, comes from the Latin cooptare, meaning to select, to incorporate into one's group or tribe, and can now also indicate a more abstract process of taking something over or absorbing it, particularly where the absorbing body is seen as somehow opposed or hostile or at least indifferent to the thing absorbed. The process of co-option converts something which stands against or apart from a system into something which is a functional component of the system. We might think of it as analogous to the action of a white blood cell in a human body, neutralizing pathogens which pose a threat to that body's healthy functioning. The idea of co-option may be thought of as the inverse of another political category, which has been of central importance to Marxists, the notion of alienation. Alienation occurs when something which should be a part of me, or should belong to me, or be somehow with me, comes to stand apart from me as either indifferent to my interests or actively hostile to them. For Marxists, the most significant form of alienation is the alienation of labor. Our work is our creative expression, deeply bound up with our identities. It should be a part of us, our own. But under capitalism, and in different ways in any class society, our labor is sold to another in such a way that it becomes something alien, meaningless, even hostile. For Marx, alienation from labor also means both estrangement from other human beings and a kind of enslavement, self-loss, or dehumanization. That is why Marxists and many anarchists agree that wage labor must be abolished in order to bring about the conditions of freedom that will allow human beings to become truly human. It's worth noting that, although Marx has no interest in attaching the words wrong or unjust to the phenomenon of alienation, and indeed is consistently critical of moralistic approaches, it makes some sense to think of the revulsion against alienation as the moral core of Marxism. There is something that class societies do to people which is dehumanizing, and capitalist alienation dehumanizes in a particularly profound way. It is from this that the human need for revolution arises. So, there is a symmetry between the notions of alienation and co-option. To alienate is to take something that is or should be a part of or belong to someone or something, and to make that something alien, indifferent, or hostile. To co-opt is to take something that stands apart, or wants to, or ought to stand apart, separate from or opposed to something else, and make it a part of that thing. The specific phenomenon of co-option is relevant in politics. We may disagree about what does and does not count as an instance of it, but we can recognize the existence of a syndrome in which what starts out as opposition or dissent ceases to be this, apparently through gaining a kind of status or acceptance that might easily be mistaken for success. Think of the allocation of a few women to positions of highly visible power or status within institutions which remain male-dominated in their composition and patriarchal in both their internal structures and external effects. This kind of tokenism is one form of co-option, an instance of a broader strategy of neutralizing threats by absorbing them, of exploiting opposition. So, what does it mean for a body of thought and practice like feminism to be co-opted? What does it look like? Co-option is not just a matter of feminism being interpreted in a way that narrows the scope of critique, blunts its force, or makes it appear absurd and hence easy to dismiss, but a matter of feminist ideas being more positively turned to the advantage of elements within the status quo which seem either to have nothing to do with women and feminism or to represent interests actively opposed to those of women. It is then that feminism is put to use. Two examples will help clarify this phenomenon of the co-option of feminism. The first I will discuss under the label of colonial feminism. In January 2013, it was announced that women would for the first time be allowed to be frontline soldiers in the US Army. This news was greeted with satisfaction in all quarters of the mass media. Often, there was a clear suggestion that this development was a measure of the progress of feminism. The assumption was that everyone, including all feminists, should join in celebrating this latest step toward equality. If any feminist were to object to all this on grounds of an opposition to the recent and ongoing wars waged by the US, the probable response would be that this is a separate issue. But, by a similar reasoning, should feminists celebrate in the name of equality the fact that women, too, have exercised the opportunity to torture prisoners at Abu Ghraib? It seems obviously and offensively besides the point to call for equal participation in practices which it has become routine to condemn. Historically, feminists have been neither consistently pro-war nor of the view that violence, women and patriarchy were issues that could be kept separate. There have been strong alliances between feminists and anti-war movements. For example, the opposition to the Vietnam War was to a large extent organized and participated in by women, although they usually did not occupy the most visible roles. Whilst liberal feminists have tended to focus on making sure that women and men participate on equal basis in existing institutions, including the military, many radical feminists have understood their feminism to imply a rejection of the violence brought about by patriarchal states. The most compelling forms of feminism have been clear that we have to fundamentally change existing social structures, and that this cannot be done by just add women approach, which simply inserts women into those structures. Contemporary feminists have often pointed to the disproportionately destructive impact that war has upon women. They have pointed out that, contrary to common association of war with male sacrifice, most of the victims of modern wars are civilians, and most of them women and children. They have analyzed the role of rape in war and colonialism. They have opposed war as a major form of predominantly male violence. However, in recent years, these voices have tended to be covered by louder ones, which have cheered on the wars waged by the US and its allies, and all in the name of feminism. What some have dubbed colonial feminism argues that invasions in countries such as Afghanistan and Iraq by Western powers are justified by the overriding good of liberating the women of those countries from a patriarchal oppression which has come to be symbolized by the burqa. But, in questioning whether colonial feminism is a strand of feminism at all, it's worth keeping in mind that those waging wars on feminist pretext are not always such impassioned feminists at home. Also, their priorities and patterns of military and political intervention and non-intervention are not plausibly demonstrative of a commitment to the liberation of women as opposed to the pursuit of oil. Those actions do not in fact produce the liberation or advancement of women, but tend to punish women disproportionately. There's also, not as often suggested, a painful liberal dilemma between rolling in with the tanks and standing by and doing nothing. Those who are actually interested in the fate of women in other countries could begin by opposing policies by their own countries which kill, maim, impoverish, and prostitute those women under the banner of liberation, and could be extending their support and solidarity to indigenous feminist movements in the Middle East, for example, which do exist, albeit often in extremely difficult circumstances. Colonial feminism does not begin or end with a pro-war position. There has also been a general shift in academic feminism's focus on the plight of women in non-Western countries and also the position of women from cultural minorities within liberal states. A now familiar topic in political philosophy addresses this question under the "Is multiculturalism bad for women?" The title question is of the influential essay by liberal feminist Susan Moller-Okin. This is a strange and unsettling debate, if approached with the expectation that feminist, multiculturalist, and anti-racist politics should go hand in hand. Since what Okin and some others argue is that there is a tension or dilemma as to how one balances a commitment to women's rights or their freedom or well-being with a commitment to multiculturalism. The two come into apparent conflict, Okin suggests, when we recognize that many minority or non-Western cultures are more patriarchal and illiberal than the majority of cultures of modern Western liberal democracies. On the one hand, many liberals are committed to pluralism, diversity, and to what they see as an attitude of tolerance towards cultural difference, arguably extending to certain illiberal practices and values. On the other hand, they see themselves as committed to the equal moral worth of all human beings, whether male or female, and regardless of racial or cultural background. Then the worry is that liberal tolerance comes into conflict with feminist ideals, particularly as to the autonomy of women, their freedom to choose their own lifestyle and style of dress, and so on. Minority cultures, it is argued, tend to contain many elements which are deeply patriarchal and illiberal, such as honor killings, forced marriage, veiling, segregated prayers, and a whole host of informal social pressures and expectations for women to be submissive, dependent, uneducated, and chaste. Many liberals are terrified of the charge of being culturally imperialist, but are in equal measure disgusted by the various illiberal, patriarchal, and downright violent practices which they associate with immigrants and foreigners. And the result of all this is the confused debate over feminism and multiculturalism. The debate over multiculturalism and feminism is made a frustrating one in part by the fact that it proceeds on the basis of premises that are very ill-defined. So, the first thing we should ask, since the answer is not often clear, is, are we doing ideal theory, or are we arguing about what should happen in the world as we know it? If this is a question of ideal theory, perhaps the best thing to do is simply walk away from the debate. The project doesn't make much sense. How can we think usefully about the sorts of cultural minorities and practices that would exist in a just world, when in the real, or non-ideal world, they are unmistakably marked and shaped by the legacy and ongoing realities of racism and colonialism? If, on the other hand, we understand this as an issue belonging to non-ideal theory, we should perhaps say something similar to what many feminists are saying about military intervention, that women are harmed by racism and social exclusion still more than men are, and they are harmed again, and not helped or rescued, by any policy or influential theoretical tendency which implicitly feeds into a racist and colonialist mindset. Western patriarchal feminism is what is bad for women. It is bad for minority and non-Western women, for the obvious reason that cultural imperialism is bad for those women. And it is bad for white Western women too, because it serves to divert feminist attention from the many non-ideal aspects of their cultures, aspects which are not always recognized as such, but instead mistaken for liberation. The stance of feminism with respect to war and imperialism is mixed, and has always been mixed, something which should really come as no surprise, given the breadth of feminism as a category. Also, The cynical co-option of feminist ideas for military and imperialist ends is also nothing new, as many a comparison can be drawn between a contemporary feminist pretenses of many Western states and the hypocrisy of 19th century colonizers. Today, as in the past, there are plenty of feminists who oppose the imperialist wars of Western states and who are therefore concerned to unmask and resist the co-option of feminist sentiments for pro-war ends. So, if colonial feminism is not new, then perhaps consumer feminism is? The label does not designate only a feminism which is accepting or affirmative of a capitalist framework, a characteristic of most liberal feminism, after all, but the feminism that is capitalist in an aggressive sense, a feminism to be bought and sold, a consumer feminism. This will be our second example of the co-option of feminism. There are two main aspects to this form of co-option. The first concerns the reduction of feminism to a series of personal lifestyle decisions, or more precisely to a series of purchases. The second, closely related aspect is the use of feminist sentiments, values, and rhetoric in order to sell products. Feminism sells in a double sense. It sells in the intransitive sense in which we say that products sell, as something which can be picked up off the shelf and bought. And it sells as we say that sellers sell. It appears as a force or agency which facilitates the sale of things other than itself. Let's consider first the transitive sense in which feminism sells, the idea of using feminism to sell things. This phenomenon may be more or less explicit. One of the crudest examples is probably an advertisement for Canadian tar sands oil, which features women in burqas and describes the horrific practices inflicted on them by the Saudi Arabian government and society more generally, juxtaposing this with the ethical oil that lies beneath the sands of Canada, just waiting to be extracted and enjoyed with a clear conscience by good feminist motorists. That is, extracted through a fracking process which threatens to contaminate local water supplies and which has been opposed by native Canadian communities. But there are also many more examples where products are sold to women on the basis that they will empower and or liberate them, where the rhetoric used to sell these products is often quite transparently borrowed from the language and ideas of 20th century second-wave feminism. L'Oréal's famous "Because You're Worth It" and Revlon's revolution in eyelash technology, as well as the injunction to stand up to split ends, and so on. In these last examples, the phenomenon of co-option of feminism in order to sell things comes together with the other aspect I mentioned earlier, the reduction of feminism to individual purchase and consumption. This is not just a matter of buy this if you're committed to feminist principles. The message becomes something more dramatic. Being a feminist just is buying this, that or other product. This product will make you free, and being free means buying this product. Feminism, what it stands for and what it strives for, starts to become something that can be simply picked up off the shelf. As Nina Power is pointing out, this brand of feminism is too nice, altogether too unthreatening. It's basically vacuous and superficial, but also too bitchy. It's also worth pointing out that this combination of features of the new face of feminism, especially in the context of competition with other women, looks suspiciously like a classic patriarchal stereotype of women. Suddenly, the stereotype is identified with the up-to-date manifestation of feminism. As Nina Power is pointing out, the three strands of this new ethos are closely intertwined. For feminism to be as cheerful as this, for it to be all about having fun, seems difficult to square with an awareness of the continuing oppression of women. Our heads will need to be empty of this, devoid of structural analysis, genuine outrage, or collective demand. How else could feminism maintain this happy-go-lucky quality? The emptiness here is more profound, however. It is not just a matter of chucking out the anger and the political analysis, living a shell-like feminism that amounts to a set of instructions as to what to buy. As Power observes, there is a connection between the radical vacuity of this consumer feminism and a vicious and distinctively unsisterly brand of self-assertion. Quote, "If feminism is something you define for yourself, then what's to stop it being pure egotism, pure naked greed. Absolutely nothing. There's also another type of capitalist feminism which might be termed corporate feminism, or the boardroom approach. This is not so much about getting women to buy things, nor about selling feminism to women, nor about using feminism to sell things. Instead, this is a kind of feminism which identifies liberation for women with being a successful entrepreneur. Emancipation for women is a matter of their becoming, in ever greater numbers, the exploiters rather than the exploited under capitalism. This stance, which has been labeled trickle-down feminism, is a particularly aggressive form of reformism. It not only leaves the existing system intact, it encourages women to trample on anyone who gets in their way, including other women, on their route to the top. Moreover, it implicitly or explicitly blames the majority of us who are not successful entrepreneurs, CEOs, or lawyers. To return to the notion of co-option, the notion of hijacking by absorption, the kinds of feminists just outlined may be considered an instance of the co-option of feminism on a grand scale, to the extent that we view capitalism as a system indifferent or hostile to the interests or advancement of women. As Nina Power again put it, capitalism, which in a sense knows no morals, or at least can change them easily, couldn't care less about the positive, happy feminist reclaiming of sex, so long as it makes a buck out of skimpy nightwear and thongs. So much for the newest faces of feminism. So far, there has been a lot said about what feminists should not do, and too little about what they should do. I don't really wish to leave you with the nagging question, if not that, then what? But, as I also don't know the answer, I will just use Angela Davis's words to think about a way forward. For a feminism that does not capitulate to possessive individualism, a feminism that does not assume that democracy requires capitalism, a feminism that is bold and willing to take risks, a feminism which fights for women's rights, while simultaneously recognizing the pitfalls of the formal right structure of capitalist democracy. This feminism does not say that we want to fight for the equal right of women to participate in the military, for the equal right of women to torture, or for their equal right to be killed in combat.